I'm excited to be here this morning. Good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Lynn Murphy-Michelopoulos, the Resilience Monitoring and Evaluation Advisor at BHA. And Mark and I are going to go through resilience monitoring for the RFSA and specifically focused on the recurrent monitoring survey. Should I indicate when I need to do the next slide? Great. So what we're going to do in terms of our agenda, I'm going to start us off by just talking about the rationale for why you would use the recurrent monitoring survey, and kind of talk about what are some of the things you need to be thinking about, when will be the appropriate use for it, what are some of the benefits, and then move into measurement considerations, do an overview of what we kind of collect. So in terms of shocks, capacities, and well-being outcomes, Mark will go into more detail about that and also speak to the implications for adaptive management. And then Mark will kind of take us home and giving some examples from using the recurrent monitoring survey in Bangladesh and Madagascar, and then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. So next slide, please. So the recurrent monitoring survey, you can go to the next slide. The rationale or why you'd use it, it's really a useful tool to help support project management and learning. It can really help you adapt your activities and really try to figure out how your activities are strengthening resilience capacities of the target populations with who you're working with. The resilience measurement framework in general focuses on the relationship between commonly experienced shocks and stresses, the responses to those shocks and stresses, and changes in well-being outcomes. Data collection can either be triggered by a shock or collected within specific intervals when shocks or stresses are likely to happen. And Mark will speak more to this, but there's really been a movement to not have the RMS being triggered by a shock, but just at regular intervals, because unfortunately, shocks and stresses are pretty inevitable in terms of their occurrence where we're working. One of the benefits of the recurrent monitoring survey, you're really collecting data from the same individuals or households over time. So you're using panel data, which allows you to typically rely on a relatively smaller sample size. And I'll speak more to this as well, but it includes both qualitative and quantitative data. And it also includes subjective measures of how households are actually experiencing the shock. Next slide, please. So some of the things that you need to consider for the recurrent monitoring survey, and this is not an issue in terms of the RFSA, but you really want to make sure that the project and activities are resilience focused. So there really needs to be a clear theory of change on how the project activities are actually strengthening or building the resilience capacities that are linked to a specifically and explicitly defined shock. You want to make sure that there is enough sufficient support and internal capacity to be able to conduct an RMS. And from your all's viewpoint, this could be, the RMS could be collected by an implementing partner through the M&E team, field staff, or even a third party. And you really want to make sure that there's enough capacity to be able to conduct it efficiently. And you want to make sure that there's enough in the budget. Next slide, please. So in terms of data collection considerations, you really want to know what you expect to change and when over each interval and over each time period. So, and you also want to make sure that you have a good understanding up front of what information that you want to collect at each round. And then there may be some things that you collect at certain intervals and, maybe the beginning and the end, and then data that you're collecting ongoing throughout each of those stages. You also want to make sure that you're collecting data that is sensitive to rapid change. So you don't want to collect data that's, longer term change, because you're not going to see it within those intervals of time. Next slide, please. And you can go to the next one. So there are overall 3 different categories of what we're measuring using the recurrent monitoring survey. And we're looking at capacity. So those are those things that individuals, households, groups, and systems they actually draw upon to manage or adapt to shocks and stresses. So this could be women's empowerment, livelihood opportunities, social capital, social networks, access to use of essential services, because this could be access to early warning systems. You really want to collect data on the shocks and stresses that are experienced or exposed to at the individual, household, community, and systems level. And then finally, you want to collect information related to well-being outcomes. These outcomes can vary in terms of what the project is looking at, and so this will be related to the theory of change. This could be food security, improve health, reduce poverty. So you want it to be things that are sensitive to rapid change. Next slide, please. We also just wanted to mention and highlight that resilience is really focused at multiple layers and multiple levels. So it's not only at the individual level and household level, but can really collect data at the community and systems level as well. And all of these are interactive. Next slide, please. And so I'm just going to review the two types of analysis and type of data that you could be potentially collecting using the recurrent monitoring survey. And the first is doing quantitative analysis. So this can be especially useful in terms of providing statistically representative information, specifically related to shocks, the kind of trajectory of resilience capacities over time, and then looking at how people are participating in specific project activities or interventions, and then looking at what kind of coping strategies are people adopting over time. One of the limitations of using quantitative analysis is this can be costly, and it requires staff with sufficient analytic capacities to be able to do this type of analysis. And then you can go to the next slide, please. And then we have qualitative analysis as well, which can really help you answer the how and the why. And it can really help you, for example, if you're wanting to understand, if you have like a systems level impacts, and you can see, even if households are not directly participating in activities that are at the systems level, you can look at what are those impacts where households may not be directly participating. You can also collect factors related to resilience capacities and or shocks and stresses that aren't easily quantifiable, things that you may not have thought about. You can really get a lot of information through qualitative methods. It really, opposed to quantitative analysis, it's not representative, and it requires field researchers to be able to provide that high quality information and to be able to assess that information from the households. So with that, I'm going to shift over to give the floor to Mark, who will go through the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn, and thanks, everyone. Yes, this is Mark Langworthy. I'm with Tango International, and we at Tango have been engaged in conducting recurrent monitoring systems for a number of years now, initially in the context of resilience impact evaluation studies that we've been engaged in, but then also more recently working with RFSAs and helping to set up RMS as monitoring tools for RFSAs. And so I'll be discussing a little bit about our experience setting up RMSs as project monitoring tools. Next slide, please. So, as Lynn has mentioned, one of the critical pieces of information that we collect in all RMS systems is information about shocks and stresses, and we make the distinction between shocks, which are what we think of as being sort of shorter term, more sudden onset negative things that affect individuals, communities, households. And then stresses, which are longer term, more gradual kinds of negative effects that affect the households, communities, systems as well. RMS systems normally focus on these shorter term shocks, just by the nature we're collecting this information in shorter time periods. And we can think about a number of different categories or a typology really of different kinds of shocks and stresses. In terms of the time frame, so we can think about, in this list we have acute, which are rapid onset and usually short in duration, as opposed to chronic. And you can think about sort of a range of different kinds of shocks and stresses, from shocks like earthquake, for example, which is very sudden with little or no warning at all, to things like floods, which are also quite sudden. There might be a little bit more warning, to sort of longer term weather things like droughts, where there is a longer time period and perhaps more of a warning about the lack of rainfall that will be occurring. And then, the even longer term sort of climate change, long-term changes in weather patterns based on climate change. So there's sort of a time frame dimension that we can think about. We can also think about how widespread the shocks are, and in the terminology that's used is we talk about idiosyncratic shocks, which are shocks that affect individuals or just small numbers of people. They don't affect a group. So this would be examples would be things like a family member falls ill and is no longer able to work, or a fire that a single household has a fire that burns down their home. That would be idiosyncratic, as opposed to covariate shocks, where the shocks affect a large number of people within a geographic area. So this would be things like floods, droughts, conflict, things like that. And typically, for the purposes of projects, we're really more interested in these covariate shocks, but we also need to make sure that we understand if there's widespread idiosyncratic shocks that are affecting our communities. And then there's dimensions about how shocks might be related in terms of interactions across shocks. And shocks may happen sort of at the same time, which obviously creates a problem for households that need to adjust to or respond to those shocks in a short period of time. Shocks may happen sequentially, and this, for example, as a result of flooding, let's say, there can be a follow-up of a shock of waterborne diseases affecting the communities that are in the flooded areas, things like that. So there's a number of different sort of dimensions of shocks and characteristics of shocks that we need to be important to be aware of. But it's really important that in our RMS, we collected information about these different sizes of shocks. Next slide, please. And next slide. So the other sort of type of information that we collect that Lynn mentioned is about resilience capacities. And we normally think about three sort of broad categories of resilience capacities. What we call absorptive capacities are capacities that allow households to be able to better respond to shocks when they're exposed to those shocks, or also to be able to avoid the negative impacts of shocks by making preparations for shocks before they happen. So that's what we considered to be absorptive capacities. Adaptive capacities refer to capacities that give households or communities or individuals the ability to make proactive decisions about normally what we're thinking about in terms of households or individuals is livelihoods. What can they do to engage in livelihoods that are less exposed to different kinds of risks of different kinds of shocks? So there's more of a proactive decisions about what kinds of activities people engage in to avoid shocks in the future. And then the third type of capacity is what we call transformative capacity. And this is this really the way to think about, the way I think about transformative capacity is really the enabling environment. How absorptive and adaptive capacities, we can think about those as being really mostly at the level of individuals and households. And the transformative capacities are characteristics of the households or the systems that those households live in, and in which they, allows them to have greater or less absorptive and adaptive capacities. Next slide, please. So this slide is, I'm not going to go into great detail on all of this elements in this slide, but basically a couple of things. One is just for you to understand that within these broad categories of these resilience capacities, there are a number of different components. That resilience capacities is a very much a multidimensional sort of concept. And as you build an RMS system, you need to be aware of this sort of menu of different kinds of components of resilience capacities. Obviously, when you're thinking about setting up a system for a particular project, you would want to focus on some of these capacities that are of particular focus or of concern to the project interventions. But there's a number of things that you need to consider under these. The other thing I would want to point out here is that these categorizations of these capacities are not, there's overlap. So, for example, you might notice that under absorptive capacity, we have asset ownership, but we also asset ownership is under adaptive capacity. So assets can help households, if they're exposed to shocks, if they have assets, they'll be able to sell those assets to provide cash for them to be able to be better recover from those shocks that they're exposed to. But having assets also allows households to make investments in other kinds of activities that reduce their exposure to shocks. So these, these different capacities are not, there's not a clear, distinction between them. There's overlap. Next slide, please. And next slide. The other the third major type of information that we want to collect in the RMS systems is measures of the well-being outcomes of our target populations. So essentially what we're trying to do in resilience programming is giving households the wherewithal to enhance their resilience capacities so that when they are exposed to shocks, their well-being outcomes will be less affected, or they'll be able to recover their well-being in the face of shocks that they're exposed to. So in BHA, in RFSAs, obviously food security is a critical well-being outcome that we would normally want to focus on. But we can also think about measuring well-being outcomes in different dimensions in terms of how health outcomes, general economic outcomes, security, and education could be another dimension that we would want to look at. As I say, normally in RFSAs, we're particularly focused on looking at food security outcomes. Next slide, please. Now, I think that as Lynn discussed, these RMS systems, we're collecting information on these three different areas. That is shock exposure, resilience capacities, and outcomes on short intervals. And we collect this from, it's a panel design. So we're collecting this information from the same households repeatedly. And I think you can see how this could be quite a useful sort of management tool, because we're collecting information about these different dimensions of resilience over short periods of time. We're getting information about how households are responding to shocks and the extent to which different resilience capacities are affecting the abilities of households to respond to those shocks. And importantly, for adaptive management, we want an RMS system should be looking at how project interventions or project activities are influencing household resilience capacities and outcomes over time. And how successfully is the project enhancing a household's ability to recover from shocks, and if not, what are the problems? So collecting this kind of information can be very useful to really see what is happening over time within the project implementation area about how households respond to shocks and how the project activities are influencing households' ability to recover from shocks. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so what I want to do now is I'm going to talk about a couple of examples of RMS systems that we at Tango have been engaged in. And the first one is with the Bangladesh Shohardo 3. I think it's pre-RIFSA, it's actually a DIFSA in Bangladesh. CARE is the prime implementing partner. And the Shohardo 3 project established an RMS system with the objectives that were laid out here to look at the longitudinal effects of program interventions, to understanding the changes in the resilience capacities, and what were the specific components that were changing, how those related to program interventions, and using that information to help to verify or modify, if necessary, the underlying theory of change of the project, and in relation to that, sort of make adjustments in the project intervention strategy. And then the Shohardo 3 program actually received an extension, and so the RMS was actually slightly changed. The focus was really to look at shifting more to looking at systems level interventions, the transformative capacities, and how in the phase out part of the project of the Shohardo project, how effectively was the project really sustainably in strengthening those transformative capacities. Now, this Shohardo 3 project was a very large project, and they were able to commit quite substantial resources to supporting this RMS system. And so this RMS system included quite a large quantitative component as well as a qualitative component. And we designed the quantitative component to really capture many of those resilience capacities that I showed in that previous slide. So next slide, please. Just to give you sort of a brief sort of overview of the kinds of information that we're able to collect from the quantitative component of this RMS, was we were able to look at trends of the three resilience capacities, the absorptive, adaptive, and transformative, over the course of the project direct implementation period, which is sort of the left-hand side of the diagram. And you can see generally there was a general upward trend in those resilience capacities, which is, you know, a good indication of projects contributing to enhancing those capacities. Particularly strong is the adaptive capacity, which was really kind of the main focus of this project, focusing on livelihood, supporting improved livelihoods of households. But then also you can see that the information, you know, we're able to sort of trace out changes, particularly over the time frame of the COVID pandemic, where you see things started to decline, but then you know, has started sort of an indication that after the impacts of the COVID started to diminish, that then we started to see upward trends in these capacities. So this is just sort of a quick snapshot of the kinds of information that we're able to collect in this RMS, which had a large quantitative component. Next slide, please. The other example I wanted to talk about briefly was the Fiovana program in Madagascar, which is ongoing now. And this is ADRA is the prime implementing partner for this program. This is a much smaller program, and the RMS system that was developed for this program was much more much smaller in scope, and in fact is only qualitative. The project was collecting quantitative information separately in their annual monitoring survey. So, given the resource constraints that the program was working in, it was decided that the RMS would be really only qualitative. The other thing, the sort of important thing to sort of highlight about the Fiovana program, this was a refine and implement sort of strategy for Fiovana, and we undertook a resilience assessment in the refine phase of the program, and this resilience assessment identified a few key factors that were particularly important within the program area of the Fiovana. And these included increasing trends of indebtedness and the importance of social cohesion within the communities, because in many of these communities, government or official kinds of services are quite limited. So social community organization and social cohesion is quite important, but also, there was a trend of decline in social cohesion. So based on these findings, this sort of informed the design of the RMS system in the Fiovana program. It was decided that really we only needed to collect information twice a year to capture sort of the extremes of the lean and post-harvest periods. And then it focused on measuring these critical variables that were identified in the first assessment. So as always, we collected information about exposure to different shocks, but then there was a focus on looking at information about savings, borrowing, and levels of indebtedness, and then also information about changes in social cohesion, particularly looking at sort of different types of social capital and collective action engaged in the communities. And again, a critical part of the RMS as a project monitoring tool was to also capture information about the respondents' engagement or participation in different project activities, so that then the information could be used to say how participation in different activities affected the resilience capacities of households, and ultimately then how they were able to recover from shocks that they were exposed to. So that's just a very brief overview of two examples of RMS systems that we have set up, and sort of their characteristics and the kinds of information that they provide.